Hey guys, Omar here, and lately I've been obsessed with black and white photography, film photography, looking at old street photography, looking at Vivian Mayer's work. I started down this little rabbit hole of how to simulate a specific film. Now there are two films that I'm super interested in emulating, and they're kind of similar. I mean, you probably couldn't tell the difference unless you shoot both and you know about film and you develop both. But they are Kodak Tri-X and Ilford HP5. Both of those are grainy and contrasty films that have a gritty look, perfect for street photography and perfect for portraits. So I wanted to use this video to show you what I have so far. Maybe you guys in the comments can help a little if any of you have done this, but I've just started my journey on simulating these films. Now, you could probably buy a preset pack, but that is not what we do here. I made a bunch of videos, I don't know if you remember, about creating your own presets instead of buying them. My philosophy on presets you can find in that video, but to sum up really quick, I think for most looks you can figure out what you want as long as you know how your software works. Now, real film photographers take this 400 speed film and they actually can do what's called pushing the film. Instead of shooting it at 400, which is what's called the box speed, they shoot it at 800 or 1600. And what you get is Tri-X film or Ilford HP5 film, just a little bit grainier and a little bit darker. And so at first I was trying to emulate the film exact and looking at a bunch of grain examples, going to particular blogs and seeing their scans. And what I found is, depending on the subject, depending on the lighting, and depending if the person pushed the film to 800 or 1600, you're gonna get a range of Tri-X looking either kind of not so grainy to very grainy and like really dark and contrasty. So for my emulation, I kind of just want something that's gritty, has a lot of nice grain in it, but I'm not going to go overboard with the blacks and the grain. So it's kind of like Omar Gonzalez Tri-X. Okay, in case you're impatient, let's summarize the steps on creating a black and white in Capture One. Number 1, enable black and white. Number 2, use filters to create the look you're looking for. Number 3, add contrast using levels or a curve. 4, add grain. And 5, adjust your settings to fine-tune your final image. And 6, of course, print. Let's jump to it. Let's jump on Capture One. Now, the first thing I want to do if I'm going to work on a black and white is make my own black and white tool tab here. If you don't see a black and white tool tab in your Capture One, you can right-click and you can add a tool tab, and you can, these are the tool tabs you can add. So I added my own black and white tool tab just so that anytime I'm going to work on a black and white, I have these tools available to me. Now, if you can't do that, if you right click here, you might be using Capture One Express. You can't add an extra tool in Capture One Express. You'll have to get the Pro. As soon as I added my black and white tool tab, I also added some extra things that I wanted to use. For example, exposure and high dynamic range. So in case I wanted to fine tune the image, I could do it as well. Okay, so the first thing we want to do in our tool tab is let's enable the image and make it black and white. So this flat out just takes the color out. And what you want to do is sort of add filters to you want to play with the color filters. And what that does is, just to exaggerate here, is the image will look at the certain color tones and can increase or decrease the tonality of those tones. So right now, if you look at lips and also things in the back, this one will also change the tonality of skin a lot of times. And using blue will also work on skies and clothes. So the first thing you want to do is sort of work on the tonality of the image. And we can fine tune this stuff later if we want to. So that's filters. Step 3, work on the contrast. How much crunch do you want in your image? So from the Kodak Tri-X film and that Ilford HP5, they seem to really be crunchy. And this is something we've talked about also in the past that you could do in camera. I made a video all on black and white for your Fuji camera right there. How you can change the different tonalities in camera using highlights and shadows. And so we're going to do that now in Capture One, but you could do it in your camera as well if you're shooting JPEGs. And I like to use the levels. What I do is I just drag this right here for the amount of blacks I want. And just a little bit there. We don't want to go nuts. We don't want to lose all detail. And then this will sometimes bring your highlights up a bit. You can use the levels, and you also want to maybe use the Luma curve. Now, I don't recommend using RGB if you're working on black and whites, because it can affect the tones. Like, it can affect the genes, which we just fixed. You want to just deal with color up here, your color tones, and down here you just want the Luma curve. But here you can add more contrast and also give it a little bit of an S curve or something like that. Okay, so here we have the, let's say that's the contrast that I kind of want in my image. And the last step was the most exciting. And the hardest was what kind of grain really works. And it's not just grain on the image on the computer screen or on your Instagram. It's grain in when you print the images. And this was kind of the hardest part, because Capture One tells you to go to 100% so you can sort of evaluate your grain. But there's a lot of factors. The first one being what size you're going to print your images. If you're printing an image at 16 by 24, the grain will actually look larger. If you print a tiny 1 by 1 image, the grain, you probably won't even notice it. So if you really wanted to be good at this, you'd actually have to have a set size that you print at and get comfortable with how much grain you add. And then if you're gonna print larger, you have to like bring that grain back a little bit. So adding grain seems to be like the hardest part of this whole process. So let me show you how the grain tool works in Capture One and what I've been using for my Tri-X film thing up. Okay, let's bring out the grain tool. This is another great thing about Capture One. You could like bring out your tools or like put them back if you want. It's just great. But I'm gonna zoom in here to 100% as they recommend. So in Capture One, the fine grain tool seems to be their old default fine grain. It's kind of a dumber, and by the way, most grain, like Lightroom's grain, is kind of a dumb grain where they put an overlay of grain and sort of try to randomize it. From what I've noticed in the tutorials I've watched for Capture One, they've come up with a magical Harry Potter way to do grain that really simulates the silver halides and the whole process of actually developing film. They've geeked out on putting grain and having it so in the white parts of the image, the grain actually disappears, which is something that really happens when you develop your film. And also in the darkest parts of the film, the grain disappears as well. So they've added that so there's no sort of like junky little budget overlay on your images. The grain actually works like it does in real life. So to control your grain, the three things are type, impact, and granularity. So type, fine grain seems to be the default, which is the old way that Capture One uses grain. And these right here are sort of the more intelligent grains. Okay, so impact is your opacity or the amount of grain, and granularity is how grainy it is, how thick it is, how juicy it is. So let's go nuts. Let's go to harsh. And what we'll do is we'll go all the way up with impact. And that, again, is the opacity of the grain. So if we had harsh grain all the way up, but granularity all the way down, you actually get a really nice, it's got kind of like a Tri-X look going there. That might work. But as soon as your granularity starts to come up on harsh grain, you get all really old there, very 1880s. So harsh grain, crazy. Tabular grain, all right. Cubic grain seems to be a little smaller there. Soft grain and silver rich. I just can't tell the difference between them, and I don't think anyone else can. So you're gonna have to experiment to find which one works for you. Okay, so for my Tri-X film, I got it on the print here. I decided to go with a 70s-ish impact using tabular grain. And the granularity will depend on, I think, how big you print. Okay, so since I was printing 5x7, to me it seems around a 70-ish, maybe even more, but a 70-ish right now is my experimental spot for granularity. Okay, once you've experimented with contrast and how much grain you want to use on your image, I think the last step is to fine tune, not zoomed in, looking at the image as a whole. So let's end with that. Okay, and so my last step is to kind of fine tune with the look I want. I think I want a little bit more blacky black right there and a little bit more, oh, that looks great. I think that's a good levels. Nice, nice, nice. You could also work with contrast, but contrast is a little bit too aggressive for my liking. I like to fine tune both highlights and, the shadows. Now, the last thing you can kind of do if you want to go with the film look, which we mentioned in our other, creating your own presets video, I'll link it up below, is you can actually lift this up here and give the film a little bit more of a faded look. I'm going to exaggerate it so we could really see it. That's crazy, yo. But if you wanted to do this for your image, you can as well. Just fade it out a little bit. I think a little bit is kind of good, just about that much. But let's print this and see what it looks like. All right, so let's take a closer look here. So let's start with our control group. This is the print of Fine. There's Fine right there. And again, this is the default from Capture One. Great, that's our control group. 2, going to the full extreme. Full extreme is our harsh. And this was a little bit too much. Maybe someone pushing film a little bit. Maybe you want to do this, but I felt that was a little too much there. Okay, my next attempt was to try to get lucky with Capture One's Silver Rich preset. So Silver Rich, it looks pretty good, but I think it's more kind of like a T-Max film, a little less contrasty, maybe a little bit too much grain for T-Max, but maybe a film that this will look at. But this is a straight preset from Capture One's where it's called Silver Rich. My attempt was to add a little bit more grain. So I went with tabular grain and 73 impact and granularity 73. And I think it wasn't T-Max enough here. It did a pretty good job. The grain is nice on there, but I felt it just needed a little bit more punch, a little bit more grain for this print. All right, and the winner for T-Max, yeah, I think that's good grain. A little bit more harsh grain, but what's great is it retains the detail. Like her eyes are completely still sharp, so I like it. And I brought the impact down to 44, and to me this seems to work great. I think I'm going to start with harsh and sort of work with my impacts, and the granularity for harsh is at 70. So you could even get grainier than this, but I felt this was pretty Trimaxy. I like it. All right, there you have it, guys. I think in the next video, I'll show you some street photography scenes and work a little bit more on my grain and contrast for simulating films. Some people might say, if you want to simulate film, just shoot film. Yeah, you do that. I think for me, I'm having fun emulating the films and printing them and sort of as best as I can matching the look of Tri-X and Ilford HP5. That's what it's all about. It's all about having fun, and it'd be fun to have a little body of work with all these little black and whites. All right, that was fun. I'll see you next time.